Hello, and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. Before I launch into today's episode, I just have a really quick announcement to make. I've been doing some guest appearances on other people's podcasts recently, and I thought I would share it with you guys so that you can check out those episodes and also expand your podcast listening list if it wasn't long enough already. The two that I've appeared on so far are called The History Voyager and The Way. The History Voyager episode is up. I'm not sure about the Way one yet, but I will be sharing links to those in the episode notes for today's episode, as well as in my Substack newsletter. In a couple of weeks, I'll also be on another podcast called Turn of the Century, and I'll be discussing, I believe, the Boxer Rebellion and the Xinhai Rebellion. So if you want to check that one out when it comes out, you can just go and search for Turn of the Century podcast, and I will also share it again when it comes out. Okay, back to the episode. This is the fourth and final episode in the series on The Great Leap Forward. This episode is all about scholarly debate surrounding the famine, specifically what was the major cause of the famine, which factors contributed most to the high death toll, and how many people died in total. This is all rather morbid stuff, but we'll be keeping it academic for the most part. The majority of the depressing content was in the last episode anyway. This episode, I would say, is for the more statistically curious and analytic among you. It might get a bit boring for those of you who aren't really interested in academic debates about things that, let's be honest, don't really matter that much, so that's just a warning. I won't be going into specific studies or names of scholars unless it's absolutely necessary because, again, there are way too many names in this podcast in general. If you're interested in reading more in your own time on these topics, feel free to contact me using the form on the Sinobabble website, and I'll be happy to help you out. We'll also be touching on some lesser but still important and debated topics, such as why did the number of people who died vary so much from province to province, and were the CCP and Mao in particular evil and deliberately trying to starve the population. All fun and fascinating stuff. Let's start with the major causes of the famine. So, there's no doubt that the famine that lasted from roughly 1958 to early 1962 was a man-made disaster. As mentioned in previous episodes, identifiable causes of the famine range from agricultural factors like bad weather, reduction in sown acreage, and forced collectivization, to political decisions like high grain procurement, allocation of resources away from agriculture to heavy industry, bad management, and collapse of the incentives system, leading to lower worker output. While acknowledging that all of these factors played some part in the tragedy, many scholars have gone out of their way to try and determine the most important or critical factor that exacerbated the famine, usually by using very complicated statistical models. I will be completely honest and say I don't know why it's important to know something like this, but scholars need something to study, so here we are. So the factors that are usually most identified as being the most important are food availability decline, urban biased policies, and the communal dining system. Food availability was dependent upon a number of lesser contributing factors. The diversion of manpower away from agricultural work and towards rural irrigation and still projects meant that between 30 and 50% of the total rural population was not available for farming between 1958 and 1959. According to some researchers, this accounted for around 30% of the decline in food output, as much of the grain was just left to rot in the field with no one to tend to it. Adding on to this, the over-reporting of grain, in 1959, Mao made the decision to reduce the total sown acreage of all land in China by about 9.6%, as the implementation of the Leap's policies clearly meant that a surplus would be achievable even with less planting. Of course, in reality, less sown land meant less food output, no matter what the science said. Bad statistical reporting meant that procurement was often based on guesswork or, as mentioned in previous episodes, cadres trying to show that the leap was miraculously working as planned, even when it wasn't. As a result of these factors, the grain output in 1959 fell by 15%, And it's this huge loss in total output that many people identify as being the reason that the famine took place, lasted as long as it did, and took as many lives as it did. We discussed the urban biased policies at some length in the previous episode, but to recap quickly, the government overprocured grain in order to feed a growing urban population, made up mainly of newly migrated rural workers looking for manufacturing jobs in state-owned enterprises. As their food and living expenses were covered by the state, the government had no choice but to increase the amount of grain taken from rural areas to make sure the city workers were fed. Once the crisis began to unfold, the government made the decision to keep protecting workers so that the economic system didn't collapse completely, which meant depriving peasants even further. Net grain procurement in 1959 increased by 6 million tonnes. The net procurement accounted for 28% of total grain output, compared with only 14.9% and 17.4% in 1956 and 1957 respectively. Something that we didn't talk about in previous episodes was the fact that China was actually still exporting grain during this period to its neighbours. Grain exports actually reached a historic high of 4.16 million tonnes during the leap, which was 44% higher than the amount in 1958 and 2.2 times higher than the amount in 1957. So, many scholars have pointed to these very high procurement rates as the reason for starvation. And it's quite plausible, especially given the fact that most of the starvation occurred in the countryside and most of the procured grain went to the cities, who didn't really suffer from starvation, although they were deprived of as much food as they would have liked to have had. The final major factor commonly identified is consumption irrationality, or the communal dining system. As we've already discussed, around 99% of the peasant population became reliant to some extent on the food provided by the communal dining system during the Great Leap Forward. In many cases, private residences or kitchens were destroyed as part of the leap policies, and many people were forced to give up cooking implements such as woks so that they could be melted down as part of the backyard steel furnace drive, meaning that they couldn't have cooked even if they wanted to. As peasants had no choice but to eat in the canteens, many ended up eating more than they usually would, under the pretense of free supply. And with many thinking that the exaggerated grain reports were true and the CCP had really defeated hunger altogether, there was no reason to hold back. There was also a lot of food waste as part of the free supply system, due to poor management, and much food either went off or was just thrown away if it wasn't eaten at a particular mealtime. This overconsumption, coupled with waste, meant that the good harvest of mid-1958 was all gone by the end of the year. In some areas, food that should have lasted for 6 months was eaten in just 20 days. Just a few months later, people were starving and there was nothing left for the dining halls to give out. This theory about the communal dining system being the major cause is further supported by the fact that in provinces like Jiangxi, where the communal dining system was not forced upon peasants, there were fewer excess deaths due to the famine. But there are those who disagree that the communal dining system could have had that much of an impact on the number of deaths. Though in some areas peasants did eat as much as they could, with no restrictions placed on consumption, this was not a universal measure adopted by all communes. General research suggests that most canteens actually restricted consumption to the extent that by 1959 they were rather unpopular with peasants, who preferred to prepare their own food, and many of them began operating seasonally instead of all year round. I think this may be a case of local variation. It's difficult to generalize the impact of irrational food consumption when some places didn't even use their canteens in the first place, and others had sent most of their grain to the centre before the communal dining halls were even opened. So outside of these three main factors that people usually identify as being the main causes of the famine, what about all the other factors? Well, lesser factors, such as weather conditions, tend to be dismissed as major causes, especially if we're looking at the crisis from a national perspective. Something like weather could not have really affected the entire country equally. Overall, weather conditions in 1958 were fine, and areas affected by natural disasters, as the percentage of total sown area, was only 5% of the country, which was one of the lowest percentages in 3 decades. While bad weather was reported in some areas in the winter of 1958 and spring of 1959, official statistics showed that nationwide, 1959 was an average year in terms of the weather. Also, the famine had started in some areas in 1958, so weather for 1959 may have exacerbated the situation, but it couldn't have been the main causal factor, or is at least very unlikely to have been. More often than not, bad weather and natural disasters are seen as exacerbations of the bigger factors, for example, the amount of food available. If the area of sown land has been reduced, half of the peasants are away doing building work, and that area also got hit by a flood or a drought, then the amount of grain produced would naturally be even less than had all of those factors not come together to create such a mess. You could say the same thing about some of the other factors, for example, the impact of local politics and the zealotry of local cadres in implementing Great Leap policies. While the actions of certain cadres certainly exacerbated the famine in some areas, their actions were localised, and as we discussed in a previous episode, some officials actively worked to protect their local communities, undermining the central policies of the state to make sure that people stayed fed. Political radicalism is better at explaining why death rates varied so widely from province to province, as opposed to explaining the famine in general. Some provincial leaders have been remembered specifically for their zealotry during this period. Li Jingchuan, the leader of Sichuan province, for example, is remembered for sending high amounts of grain for central procurement before the leap had even begun, and for insisting that the communal dining halls stay open even after the state made it clear that they were no longer mandatory. The famine in Sichuan province not only started earlier than in most other provinces, but was also one of the most severe cases. But it wasn't just the ideologically pure that pursued extremist policies. Studies have shown that local leaders who were more ambitious were more likely to institute stricter policies during the leap in the hopes that their radical leftist behaviour would be rewarded. Basically, the leap became a career incentive for those who found that they lacked pre-revolutionary credentials, such as participating in the Long March, to move up the political hierarchy organically. These people still weren't satisfied with a middling position in the state bureaucracy or in the party, so the leap was basically a huge opportunity for them. One study found that there was as much as a 3% difference in the grain procured by the party secretaries who were full-time members of the Central Committee, which is the top body of the Communist Party, and those who were alternate members, so basically people who didn't get all the rights, privileges, and pay of being on the Central Committee full-time. This difference in political rank and the ambitions of alternate members to become full members accounts for around 16.8% of the excess death rate during the famine. So again, when we take a wide view of all of these factors that caused the leap or made it worse, we can see that they all sort of fold in on each other and end up making each other worse to some extent. Whether a factor was local or national doesn't really matter, as local problems were bad enough to make national problems worse, and every province except for a very small minority seemed to have one or more local problems to deal with, whether that be weather, careerist cadres, or overeating in the canteens. As to which national problem was the most important, again, I actually think that varies based on province. Saying that the decline in sown area was the biggest problem nationally depends on whether the province in question reduced their sown area as much as another, which would then depend on how zealous the cadres in that province were, which would depend on how many people were sent off for irrigation works instead of farming, etc., etc. I think it's all too interwoven to really choose beyond a shadow of a doubt which one had the most impact, but of course you are more than welcome to make that decision for yourself. Probably the biggest cause for debate among Great Leap scholars has been the topic of how many people died during the famine. This is usually expressed using the term excess deaths, so that people conducting studies distinguish the famine death toll from whatever the normal base rate death toll would have been. I'll be using the phrase excess deaths a lot throughout, as I think this distinction is important, but also because the baseline number of deaths used by some scholars has been seen as controversial, and in some cases people have been accused of inflating the total number of famine deaths by rejigging what is considered the normal death rate. I've always found discussions around how many people died a little bit pointless. Not because I think we shouldn't try and find out, or because discussions surrounding numbers of deaths are in bad taste, but I do have practical and personal reasons for feeling this way. First of all, it's been pretty much agreed on that there is no accurate way of knowing how many people died, and we'll get into why that is in a moment. Bearing in mind that we'll never be able to get an accurate number, I just feel that the bickering over whether it's 30 million people or 45 million people is kind of petty. I also feel like some of the people who go for the much higher numbers have very specific reasons for doing so, either to get more shock value and exposure for their works, or because they really, really don't like Mao and the CCP and want to make them look as bad as possible. As I will discuss, those people who have higher numbers of deaths also tend to blame the central leadership and Mao more specifically for causing the famine, and tend to more freely attribute nefarious characteristics to these people. Secondly, perhaps it's the historian in me, but I've always felt that focusing on the numbers of deaths in any given tragedy reduces the impact and therefore longevity of that tragedy. I never thought I'd find myself saying this, but I kind of agree with Stalin when he says, if only one man dies of hunger, that's a tragedy. If millions die, that's only statistics. We remember events such as the Holocaust so vividly, not because we focus on how many people died, but because of the way in which those people are remembered. We have documentaries, diaries, museums, memorials, and other memorabilia that lay out the memories and experiences of people who actually suffered during the Holocaust and under Nazi rule in general. Perhaps the Great Famine in China would have more impact if we had any of these things, but the truth is that personal recollections or memorabilia from this time are not only scarce, but people are reluctant to come forward with information due to the censorship policies of the CCP. Now all we have is a few diaries, few are still available in translation, and I guess guesstimates from academics about the true scale of the catastrophe. But the number of deaths is treated like a big deal in the Chinese academic community, and people really, really want to be the person who is the most accurate. So let's take a look at how the discussion around numbers has evolved over the past few decades, and how academics have come to the conclusions that they have. Early estimates of the number of excess deaths in the period 1958 to 61 were based on demographic information released by China in the early 1980s. After the 1982 census was made public, demographers jumped on the data that was previously inaccessible to outside researchers. This was one of the first proper censuses published in China since the PRC was founded, as previous ones had been fairly simple or limited, for example, to just urban registers, and didn't contain enough information to plot trends or discover anything untoward. Also, all previous data had been subject to state censorship. The 1964 census wasn't even publicised in the Chinese news, and no exact figures were released to the public. This withholding of information was obviously not only a pain for foreign observers, but for policymakers and administrators in China as well. The ability to identify the root causes of problems and find solutions to them is clearly severely hampered when you don't know how many people you're dealing with or where they are. This is why the census of 1982 was so highly anticipated. People immediately noticed the discrepancies for the period of the Great Leap Forward, and there was universal consensus that some sort of demographic crisis in the 1950s and early 1960s had taken place, which, trust me, is very unusual. Academics don't usually agree on anything. What they didn't agree on was the number of deaths. The first study to point out the effects of the Great Leap Forward on population was published in 1981 and suggested that the death rate during the period was about 1.5 times higher than normal, leading to around 16.5 million deaths in excess of the average during the 4-year period. A second study, published the next year, in 1982, pumped this number up to 23 million excess deaths, although they do point out that there are many problems with the data, which makes the figure unreliable. For example, the information in the national census shows a healthy rebound in birth rates from 1962 onwards, which wouldn't necessarily be possible if the famine had been that bad. It's more likely it would have taken a few years for birth rates to reach their pre-leap levels, showing that the official data is either just a rough estimate or has been fudged in certain areas. It also became clear as time went on that the census was incorrect in its report of China's total population by somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. Either way, it wasn't reliable and further information was needed. The further information came in due course, and numbers were revised once again. A study published in 1984 that looked at birth rates, fertility, and food availability during the period estimated that around 30 million people died as a result of the famine. Other estimates from that year range from 30 to 33 million. In fact, estimates for the total number of excess deaths stayed around this range for the next 20 years, and didn't really peak over 33 million until we got into the noughties. So, what happened after the millennium to cause such a huge leap in the estimated numbers of deaths? The main changes occurred due to the availability of local archives and official figures, which allowed academics to recalculate existing generic figures based on local data. Yang Jisheng, the author of the book Tombstone that I read from in the last episode, takes earlier estimates from people who had worked out around 30 million people and adds his own workings out to make the figure around 36 million people. The very highest estimate I've heard is around 50 or 55 million, although more recently estimates of around 40 to 45 million have become more mainstream. This figure especially appears in one of the most popular books on the Great Leap Famine, which is called Mao's Great Famine by scholar and author Frank de Kurt. Now, I said I wouldn't be bringing up people's names specifically, so I feel like a huge disclaimer is necessary here. I do not like de Kurter's book or his treatment of the famine in general. I'm not salty that he is popularizing knowledge about China and Chinese history. As someone who's trying to do something similar, I consider it God's work. However, I do think that in writing for a general audience, for a popular audience, there are some problems that emerge that have been pointed out in detail by other scholars, which I will relate for you here. To explain mine and other people's problems with the book, I should go over what it actually says and how he comes to the conclusions that he does. So, in writing his book, de Kuyter had access to 11 provincial archives, which is amazing because if you know anything about trying to do research in China, you know that getting access to archives is getting harder and harder. The book's main argument is that the party increased food procurement, knew that people were starving and didn't care, and that Mao said if half of the population died it would be fine, and that society completely broke down as people resorted to smuggling, stealing, hiding, or foraging food to survive. He says that 30 million deaths is far too low of an estimate. People don't pay enough attention to the amount of ecological damage done by the famine, and also Mao Zedong is evil. The book received much praise and won the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction, which was formerly the Samuel Johnson Prize, in 2011 when it was published. But apart from the praise, the book also has its fair share of critics, and for good reason, in my opinion at least. It tends to extrapolate local village, county, and provincial level data and experiences and apply these findings to the country as a whole, or even if he doesn't directly apply it, he kind of just uses an example and then, leaves it hanging. This doesn't really work considering we know that the death rates varied greatly from province to province and even village to village depending on the factors that we discussed earlier. It wouldn't be so bad if the examples chosen were generalistic, but usually he chooses the most extreme examples to make a case, for example by stating that rape was commonplace or that everybody stole and broke the law in order to survive. The book basically ignores the larger context of Chinese history as well. If you cast your mind back to the first episode I did on the famine, I mentioned that famine in China was a recurring historical event. Many large-scale tragedies are within living memory, and though a lot of them were localized, many of them did reach the millions of deaths in numbers. As reviews of the book have pointed out, there was a famine as recently as the Republican period, and just in general, as Chinese peasants were always living at subsistence levels, death rates were relatively high before the famine as well. De Kuyter seems to push all of these things to one side for the sake of his overall narrative. One scholar points out that de Kuyter deliberately underestimates pre-famine death rates so that deaths resulting from the famine can be exaggerated, and a higher death toll can be made more plausible. So their argument is basically that Duterte is trying to have it both ways. The CCP deliberately caused the famine, or their policies would never have worked, but somehow they had managed to improve things over the past 10 years. It's just a little bit muddled. Overall, the book just seems a bit sensationalist. It's got a lot of anecdotal stuff and relies quite heavily on interview testimony, which is fair enough because it's supposed to be for general consumption and it's not just an academic book. But in the preface and introduction, he does go on about how he has unique access to archival documents, how rigorous his research was, and how it was actually funded by academic institutions. It may be a popular book, but that's no reason why it should just harbour certain subjective biases, which in my opinion it clearly does. As one review of the book points out, it's quite convenient that the number 45 million is just enough to push the famine into the greatest mass killing in history. The author also adds in around 5 million extra deaths from people he reckons were beaten to death or driven to suicide by the extreme circumstances. This doesn't change the statistical figures, but the author seems to think that it matters. The book also paints Mao to be the architect of the whole thing. Now, to be clear, I'm no fan of Mao or communism in general, but to say that the biggest factor in the famine was Mao himself is not only ignoring historical fact, but I feel is a bit biased, and I feel that this is somewhere where the author's personal agenda is colouring his work. Mao couldn't be everywhere at once. People may have felt the need to over-report production in order to please him, but he did actually actively discourage the practice at one point, which we'll get into in a little bit. So, with all that being said, which estimates about the numbers of deaths are most reliable? Today, most people tend to stick to the 30 million range. It's very uncontroversial, especially when you're writing sort of cursorily around the famine in books or papers that deal with other aspects of the period, but not the actual death toll itself. For example, my PhD thesis was about 1950s propaganda and also spilt into the 1960s, so I just used the figure 30 million as sort of a catch-all. Like I said, we'll never actually know how many people died, and I just think it's a bit much for someone to state with authority that, everyone else's estimate is wrong and mine is right, regardless of what that number is. But, to each his own, I can't criticise people for not doing their homework at least. How people want to draw their own conclusions about the famine is really just their own concern. All I know is that far too many people died, and knowledge about the famine should be brought to the general public's attention, even if it is through the form of debatable statistics. Okay, before we wrap up this episode and this chapter on the Great Leap Forward, I just want to touch on the arguments surrounding Mao's involvement in the famine and the extent to which he is an evil mastermind, I guess. To reiterate the point that I made at the beginning of this episode, the famine was largely man-made, and it was the result of central policies which were enacted to varying degrees in different locales. Now, there's blaming Mao for the Great Leap Forward, which is totally valid, and then they're saying that Mao deliberately starved his population because he could, and because he thought that it was in the best interest of the country for some reason, or because he is a crazy evil person. I think it's quite important to discern what Mao knew from what he didn't know, and what he did do from what he didn't do. So let's just take a look at some facts first. So fact, Mao had received some isolated reports of edema and starvation in 1958 and 1959, which he asked the appropriate local leaders to investigate and rectify in their policies. Remember as well that in the previous episode we noted that Mao wanted the provinces to be more independent as part of the party's general aim to decentralize the economy, which the commune system was supposed to play a huge role in. Another fact, in early March 1959, Mao criticised excessive leftism and the treatment of peasants, stating that, quote, peasants have to live and therefore have to conceal 15% of their production. This shows that he was aware that peasants hoarded grain as a matter of course, and that local officials should adjust their policies towards peasants and think about their livelihoods and act according to reality, not just the directives given to them from their superiors. Fact: Mao felt attacked by Peng Dehuai at the Lushan Conference in 1959, and after that went on the offensive, saying that those who wanted to stop the leap were pouring cold water on the revolution and risked negating all the achievements that they had gained because of a few errors. A second anti-rightist campaign was launched that was much worse than the one in 1957, and around 3.6 million cadres were purged for their rightism. The leap was relaunched with greater fervour, personally stoked by Mao, causing larger procurements and more reliance on canteens during the year 1959. Fact: in February 1960, Mao became aware that major urban centres were beginning to suffer from grain shortages and ordered redistribution policies to be implemented immediately. In March, he sent out instructions to communes to solve what he called the 5 problems: over-reporting, the use of force, the communist wind, corruption, and waste. But overall, he was fairly lenient with cadres and stated in 1960 that, quote, "the national situation was very good, and the majority of cadres are good people doing good and praiseworthy work." This was coupled with the fact that some provincial leaders were still lying about the extent of the famine in 1960 in order to remain in Mao's good graces, contrasting with the reports of famine in other provinces that were a bit more honest. Overall, Mao was passive, slow to react, and adamant that the leap would work out in the end, even when all evidence pointed to the contrary. Now, here's why I don't think that this proves that Mao is an evil person. Mao could have been aware that there was over-reporting, but he could not have known the extent of the over-reporting, just that it was happening. On top of that, the decision of how much grain to send to the central government was made by provincial leaders, not by Mao himself, and again was based on the extent to which a province had over-reported its grain output for that season. Was Mao bad at maths and economics? Yes. Did Mao personally go down to each and every village and snatch grain out of the hands of starving peasants? Not that I'm aware of. When it comes to dealing with the people who made those decisions, Mao's main concern, in terms of those responsible, not including himself, was making sure that he wasn't so harsh that people stopped supporting the party altogether. It wouldn't have done for him to have purged or punished every single official if it meant that he and the party lost all the prestige and possibly their legitimacy in the process. Would people have even dared to tell him the truth if he was to speak to local cadres or the average peasant? They certainly didn't when Peng Dehuai went down to talk to them. Besides, Mao's closest allies were afraid of him, as we saw in the aftermath of the Lushan conference when Peng Dehuai was cruelly purged and nobody stood up for him. And also, Mao was desperate to prove everybody wrong. People wanted to make him happy, and Mao wanted to prove to his international critics that China could be completely self-sufficient and compete with the best of them. The interpretation of Mao as evil, or even if you're not saying that he's evil, callous and manipulative, also doesn't jive with Mao's overall outlook on the revolution and life in China. While he may have abandoned them somewhat for the city folk, Mao was on the side of the peasants generally speaking. He came from a small village himself, and he had relied on the peasants heavily to support the party during the Civil War and the war with Japan. I think Mao thought he was actually doing what was in the best interest of the people, and he said so repeatedly. Yes, there is an anecdotal quote from one meeting that Mao had said that it would be okay if half the population starved to ensure that the other half survived. But I think that the extent to which that can be taken either literally or as a reflection of Mao's overall perspective on China is iffy at best. I mean, this is a man who encouraged people to have as many children as possible and really believed that grain output was growing. Why would he then advocate for the deaths of those same people? The logic just isn't all there for me. He absolutely manipulated those around him, and you could argue that propaganda, which was disseminated to the masses, is also a form of manipulation. But then that's not really a personal flaw of Mao, is it? But rather the way in which high-level politics in China functioned at the time, and also propaganda is a function of most states, not just communist ones. In my personal opinion, Mao's biggest mistake is thinking that the tactics that he had used in his guerrilla days would be able to be copied and pasted nicely onto the new era of China's development. You had those who believed in continuous revolution, like Mao, actively working against people like Deng Xiaoping, who ditched the revolutionary mentality and were just trying to make a functioning economy. These frictions caused many internal revolutions, which either scared or motivated lower members of the party to work to gain the favour of whichever faction was in power. Most of the time, that faction was Mao. Just after the Great Leap Forward, it was Deng Xiaoping and the Planners clique. And then, when it came to the Cultural Revolution, it was Mao again. The tides and winds of politics in China changed so often that it's not really even fair to peg everything that happened to Mao's thoughts and feelings. The actions and reactions of those who worked for the party were just as important as the actions of the top man himself, and were not always something that he could control, which is exactly what we'll discover when we start talking about the Cultural Revolution in a few episodes' time. So, that is it for this episode, guys, and that is it for the Great Leap Forward. I believe we have covered everything. Just to let you know as well, we're not going to be going straight into the Cultural Revolution. There's a few things that happened before, in the years 1962 to 1965, so we'll be covering those. Also, in general, I think everyone needs a break, not just you guys, but also myself. And there are other fun things that I want to do with the podcast before we get into that. So that will be coming up first before we move on to the Cultural Revolution. Just a reminder, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, I have some guest appearances on other podcasts, and if you want to listen to those, we talk about modern Chinese politics, not about history. So if you're interested in modern China as well, they will be linked in the episode description. Don't forget that you can sign up for the Sinobabble newsletter by going to sinobabble.com and signing up on the website, or by going to Substack and searching for Sinobabble. You can also donate to the podcast if you wish by going to the Sinobabble website and either giving a one-off or monthly donation. Thanks so much for listening, guys, and I hope you tune in next time.